This video is sponsored by Skillshare. More about them later.
What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. For those of you watching for the first time, my name is Mike Perea. Today, I want to talk about a subject that is very, well, subjective. And that's the term proper exposure. I want to go over what that really means, which may surprise some of you. And also, I want to talk about some settings and some common issues that, well, they're not so subjective when it comes to exposure. Now, the histogram really needs to be understood before we get into proper exposure. And we're going to cover the histogram on the back of the camera. Hold on, mirrorless users. I'll get to you guys in just a second, so calm down. Now, the histogram is simply a graph that represents the total values your camera is reading in your scene. The left side of the histogram represents the blacks. Then you have the darks. The middle are the midtones, and to the right side represents the highlights and the white point. Okay, now that we have a basic understanding, let's talk about how we get an accurate histogram. You see, the histogram you're seeing on the back of the camera is based on an 8-bit JPEG, not the RAW file, and yes, you better be shooting in RAW. Now, why is it so important to know that? Well, that means you have a little bit extra dynamic range than what the histogram is actually telling you. It may show that you are slightly overexposing your highlights or maybe slightly underexposing your shadows by maybe 1/3 of a stop. But in reality, you most likely will still be okay on your RAW file. Now, I make it a habit of going off the histogram anyway, but it's important that you should still know that and still be aware of it. There are two settings on your camera that you need to change in order to get the most accurate histogram for your image. The first one is the meter mode. This is how your camera reads light and in turn determines exposure. Depending on which camera brand you have, it's called matrix or evaluative metering. The simple explanation is the meter divides up the scene into a grid, analyzes each segment, and then bases the histogram on the average of those calculations. The two modes that I don't ever use is spot metering and center weighted metering. It definitely isn't wrong to use one of these other modes, but I just don't see them being any better than, matrix metering from any situation I've ever been in. Wildlife photography is a different story, and you'll need to be able to switch between them a lot more often. The second setting that I want to go over is picture profiles. Now again, since we're shooting in RAW, these are only previews of what our photo would look like with a preset applied. If you're shooting in JPEG, then that preset will be baked into the image, so be aware of that. Here's why this matters when it comes to exposure. See, the histogram is showing that preset's tonal values. So if you have a preset that's contrasty, that preset applied from your picture profiles, your histogram is going to reflect that. So I always choose the flattest profile available. This is the closest, most accurate to a RAW file, and you can even take it a step further and go into each profile and make adjustments to the sharpening, the contrast, and the saturation to that profile just to give you that extra little bit of information to help you get that accurate histogram. I leave mine at the presets of the original settings. I usually don't mess with those. For us mirrorless users, we have an advantage through the electronic viewfinder or EVF, as well as some DSLRs on the LCD screen, and it's called exposure simulation. It's a fancy way of saying what you see is what you get. But you do have to be careful. Having the LCD screen too bright when you're in low light conditions or doing astrophotography can be deceiving when trying to determine exposure, especially when reviewing your image after you take the shot. Just be aware that you may need to adjust the brightness of the screen so that you don't mistake something looking overexposed because your screen is too bright or underexposed because your screen is too dark. Trust me, I've made exposure mistakes from this very issue. Most of the time, it's because my LCD screen was too bright. Also, turning on your highlight warning can help a lot. So now we have the settings to give us our most accurate histogram. Which brings us to our next question. How do we get proper exposure? I'm going to give you my very simple technique for just about every situation for proper exposure in landscape photography. Then we're going to go look at some examples where I think you'll be surprised at what those histograms actually look like. So this technique I use is very simple. It's called expose to the right, or ETTR. Even though I have a mirrorless camera, I always use my histogram. Like I mentioned, The brightness of the LCD screen has caused me to screw up and underexpose my photos a few times. The expose to the right concept really is pretty straightforward. When you're looking at your histogram on the back of the camera, make sure that your histogram is pushed all the way over to the right side as far as possible just before it becomes overexposed. This ensures that you're recording as much information in your shadows and in the darker areas of the scene. At its basic elements, you're simply recording light onto a sensor. So exposing to the right as much as possible, you're recording the most amount of information or light available without losing some of that important information that's in your highlights by overexposing, or in your shadows that's underexposing. If you record all of that information, it's much easier to properly expose in your post-processing session. Look at it like this: gather as much light as possible in camera, expose in post-processing. You're able to bring down exposure while editing much easier and with little downside in losing that natural contrast or introducing noise. If you don't expose to the right and need to raise exposures in darker areas and shadows of your image in post-processing, you're gonna run the risk of losing that natural contrast and introducing noise in those darker areas.
Now let's quickly talk about our sponsor. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes available with subtitles in Spanish, French, Portuguese, and German. I'm super interested in filmmaking and videography, so I took a class by Oliver Astrologo called Video Editing: Transforming Footage into Evocative Travel Stories. Oliver is a master in his field, and he also provides the footage to work with, so you can start right away with putting together a video yourself. The tips he provided for filming, transitions, and optimizing for social media were super helpful, and I'm excited to work on our next travel vlog. If you'd like to learn how to put together a short travel film yourself, then definitely head over to Skillshare by clicking the first link in the description below. And because they are sponsoring this video, the first 1,000 people to use this link will get a 1-month free trial, so definitely check out that link below.
So let's look at a few examples and we'll go over why proper exposure really depends on your scene and how you actually want your final image to look. You can see that I exposed to the right and made sure that I had plenty of information in these shadow areas. If you look at my edited image now, I wanted to give it a darker and moody feel, but if you look at the histogram, it's showing more of like it's underexposed, and actually it isn't underexposed, it's just edited to have a darker look to it. You can see that in the unedited raw image, the highlights are preserved and there's lots of room and latitude for my creative edit. When I bring down the exposure, I've maintained that natural contrast in the shadows. Now, if I was to expose it in camera like this, and then try to raise my shadows, you see much of that natural contrast is lost there. So it gives it a more flat and unappealing look. So all of the blacks and the shadows are raised at the same time, so it makes it very flat. I can try and fix it, but it requires more work to add contrast to the blacks and the shadows, as well as deal with the extra noise it brings. I just don't want or need to do that extra work. It's better if I just expose to the right and then bring down the exposure in a more natural way in post-processing. Let's talk about when exposed to the right doesn't work, at least not perfectly. That is snowy conditions. So your camera, it's dumb. It doesn't know it's looking at snow. It's simply taking a reading of the light, averaging it out, and showing you what it thinks is the proper exposure. But the problem is, all of that white, the camera reads and interprets as a middle gray. What would look like proper exposure is actually quite underexposed. As a general rule, when I shoot snowy white scenes like this, I tend to overexpose my histogram by 1/3 or even 2/3 of a stop just to compensate for that snow and its evil deception. If you move that histogram to the middle, which is considered proper exposure, you can see here that now it's horribly underexposed. Now, what happens if you're taking photos of like sunrise or sunset and the dynamic range of your scene is just too much? No matter what you do, your highlights are blown out and you're also underexposing in your shadows. Now this is very common when shooting directly into the sun. In this scenario, you need to become familiar with exposure bracketing. You take multiple exposures to make sure that you capture all of the information in the highlights and in the shadows. Generally, I take 2 or 3 exposures, one full stop apart. That usually is enough to capture everything that I need. As far as blending them together, you can go in depth and learn with tools like luminosity masking and selections, Or you can have a much simpler approach and just blend them together using the HDR function in Lightroom or any software that's out there as well. It's very easy to use, and if you're interested in my easy beginner tutorial on that, make sure to check out this video right here. Like always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.